Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Today in True Crime and Portraits podcast. I'm your host, Jane Flowers. Today's episode is about my father, Dr. Tom Boring's true crime, unsolved murder, and portrait photography by William Eggleston. As well, today is St. Paddy's Day. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone. Today I will be speaking about the fact that the National Portrait Gallery in London is fabricating and slandering Dr. Tom Boring's life and unsolved murder with a photograph of Tom taken by William Eggleston called Untitled T.C. Boring 1972 and with a photograph of Tom's home called Untitled Greenwood, Mississippi, 1973, informally known as the Red Ceiling. These two photographs were spoken about in a mini Curators tour by curator Phillip Prodger at the National Portrait Gallery in London on August the 5th, 2016. As well, I'm going to speak about the fact that these two claims about my father's murder made by William Eggleston contradict each other. One claim was made in the article Perfectly Boring, published in Oxford American Magazine, 100th issue, on March 13th, 2018, and the other claim was made with the National Portrait Gallery in London by Phillip Prodger in a mini Curators tour on August 5th, 2016. Both claims speak about my father's murder, but both claims are different from each other. You will learn how this is so later on in the episode. So this would make one think, what's the real truth about how my father was murdered? I know how he was murdered because of what I was told from my mother and my family members and what I have read in the newspapers and on his death certificate. His death certificate states he died of smoke inhalation. But William Eggleston begs to differ. He's made millions of dollars claiming with photographs of my father's nude body that he was murdered with an axe to his head. I can't find anywhere on social media where William Eggleston states Tom died of smoke inhalation. William Eggleston has claimed in his portrait exhibitions and in his films that Tom was murdered with an axe to his head. No murder weapon was ever recovered from the burnt-out remains of my father's home. This is a fact. Chief of Police Larry Stevens of the Greenwood Mississippi Police Department even stated in 1980 that he suspected that Boring hit his head on the window sill when he was trying to exit from his home that was up in flames. He stated that because Tom hit his head on the windowsill, then he thought Tom probably got the contusions on his head when he was knocked out. He said Tom possibly fell back on the floor from the impact of hitting his head on the windowsill, and he passed out from the impact hitting his head on the floor when he suspects he fell down. Tom's death certificate states that he died of smoke inhalation. Also, the police didn't find any murder weapon, and the police thought that since the medical examiner suggested he died of smoke inhalation, then he must have hit his head somehow, trying to get out of the house before he passed out on the floor. The Greenwood, Mississippi Police Department refused to label my father's death as a murder in the beginning of his investigation because they did not find any murder weapon to begin with, and they had no suspects. William Eggleston has claimed many times my father was murdered with an axe to his head, but yet there's no proof to back up his claim that I've been able to find that is factual. It would be great if my family and I could have some type of closure with my father's unsolved murder, if only we knew more about the details of how he was murdered in his home. Seeing William Eggleston knows so much about the murder weapon that murdered my father, then he should go out of his way to volunteer the information he knows to me in hopes it will help me and my family identify who murdered Tom. I mean, if Tom was supposed to be William Eggleston's best friend, per William Eggleston's claim, then wouldn't you want to know who murdered your best friend? I would definitely want to know who murdered my best friend. If I had information that my best friend's family need to help solve his murder, I would be very happy to give over the information to my best friend's family, because I know that information could help solve my best friend's murder. Because William Eggleston and his family refused to speak to me about my father's murder that they are making millions off of only fuels my suspicion even more that maybe possibly William Eggleston could have had something to do with Tom's unsolved murder, or he might know who killed my father. Will I ever know who murdered my father? Only time will tell. Now I want to go over the mini Curators tour by Phillip Prodger that was held at the National Portrait Gallery in London. There are 2 parts broken up of this tour that I want to talk about. The first part that I want to speak to you about is William Eggleston's former girlfriend, Marcia O'Hare, aka Misty Lavender, and the photograph that William Eggleston took of her called, untitled, 1974, Biloxi, Mississippi. Here is what Phillip Prodger stated in the beginning of the mini Curators tour in London about the photo of William Eggleston's former girlfriend, Misty Lavender. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to a mini tour at the National Portrait Gallery in London of this William Eggleston Portraits exhibition. I thought there's no better way to start a tour like this than with this fantastic photograph of Eggleston's girlfriend, Marcia O'Hare, taken around 1975 in Memphis, Tennessee. What's so extraordinary about is not just the composition, but also the color. The vivid greens and reds, the buttons on the dress that I described as like jelly beans. You can see the translucency, because they've been rendered using a special photographic technique called dye transfer. Dye transfer is a very complicated process. It's obsolete at the moment, but Eggleston is known for using it, especially in the 70s and 80s. To make a dye transfer print, you take a negative, an ordinary film negative, and separate it into 3 colors: blue, yellow, and red. These are then mapped onto a matrix film, representing the colors of the cyan, magenta, and yellow spectrum, and those are then exposed to light and transferred, physically transferred with a squeegee onto an ordinary piece of photographic paper. The result is what you see here. Absolutely vivid, saturated, gorgeous colors. The kinds of colors for which Eggleston is so well known. The other elements to this picture that I so admire is the use of focus. The sitter rests on a pillow almost of green grass, and the reason it looks almost cloud-like and supportive of her weight, it's because the foreground and background are allowed to go out of focus, so she seems to just be floating in space. Very clearly, Eggleston has used focus to keep her face and the first couple of buttons on her dress. As well, the Kodak Brownie camera on her left arm in focus as well, and it really draws attention from the eye to those elements of the frame and helps you to concentrate on her expression, which is dreamlike, ecstatic, almost though she's in sleep. I want to stop here for a minute and speak about Marcia O'Hare, Eggleston's ex-girlfriend. I was lucky enough to be able to get to know her and speak to her over the phone a few years ago. I befriended her on Facebook, and later I acquired her cell phone number and gave her a call. We spoke over the cell phone about my father's murder and her relationship with William Eggleston. We also spoke about William Eggleston's film, Stranded in Canton. Marcia, aka Misty Lavender, currently resides in Memphis, Tennessee, where William Eggleston resides part of the year. I asked Misty if she ever visited my father's home where the red ceiling photograph was taken, and she said no. She said she never went there and viewed the red ceiling in his home. She told me that she visited Greenwood, Mississippi at Dr. Vernon Richards' home when William filmed a scene from his film Stranded in Canton of her and Dr. Vernon Richards. Misty said she is not aware where the red ceiling photograph was really taken. She said she only knows what William Eggleston has told her. I told her that I suspect that William is lying about where the photograph was taken because other people that have seen Tom's home and the red ceiling photograph have claimed that it was taken at 508 MacArthur Street. I asked Misty if she ever heard William Eggleston talk about my father's murder. She told me he's infatuated with murder, but she didn't know much of anything really about Tom's murder, per Eggleston. I asked her if she knew anything about the weapon that William Eggleston claims murdered my father. She told me she didn't know anything about it except what William had stated conspired when Tom was murdered in his home at 103 Virginia Street. She said she didn't know if William was lying about it or not. Me, in my opinion, I definitely think that William Eggleston is lying about it. I really enjoyed my conversation with Misty. She's very sweet. Misty and William Eggleston dated in the 1970s while William was married to his wife Rosa. One thing that did irk me was the fact that Misty stressed the fact that William Eggleston was infatuated with murder. She said he really liked the subject and anything to do with it. This was puzzling to me when she stated this. Meanwhile, William Eggleston has made millions of dollars off of my father's murder all over the world. The National Portrait Gallery in London had a second part to their mini Curators tour that spoke about my father's murder, and now I want to share it with you all. Phillip Prodger went on to state, the National Portrait Gallery exhibition combines black and white photographs with color photographs for which Eggleston is so well known. But from 1960 to around 1970, black and white photography was a core part of his process. This particular photograph over my shoulder is one of my favorite from that series. Eggleston was extraordinarily attentive. He was constantly tinkering, inventing new techniques, trying things out, and in this case, he had obtained some surveillance film from the police department that was not widely available to the general public and decided to feed it into a small spy camera that he had purchased. The problem was that the spy camera was a different format than the film that he obtained. So in order to load it into the camera, he had to go in the dark room in pitch black, cut the film down, cut sprocket holes into the film so it could wind it through the camera, and then he was able to take photographs like this one, taken unawares in an intimate situation in low light conditions. What makes this photograph so extraordinary, I think, is that once he had achieved that, the ability to photograph surreptitiously in this way, one of the first people he photographed was his mom, and while there's nothing particularly selfless about this photograph, it does show a moment of extraordinary intimacy from domestic life and provides a really wonderful window on what it was like to experience life in the Eggleston household. The exhibition combines some really wonderful prints of some of the most famous images that Eggleston's ever made, with some works that have never been seen before. This is a great example. This red photograph is a well-known photograph of T.C. Boring, one of Eggleston's friends and a dentist from his hometown. Next to that, in the green, is a Polaroid photograph that comes to us now from the collection of the artist's cousin. I think, in a way, it shows the sitter the way he would have liked to have been seen, but then also the way that he was known to the outside world. T.C. Boring was a very eccentric man. He was a nudist in his home. He didn't go out in public in the nude, but when he was home, he didn't wear dress, as you can see in this photograph, and he decorated his home in extraordinary ways. The spray painting the words God, Tally-ho, and the name Mona on the wall, those were all his doing, and he created those colored rooms in his house. So he had a red room. This exists exactly the same red room that the famous photograph of the ceiling with the bare light bulb, the red ceiling by Eggleston, was taken. Well, that's how Eggleston saw him on most occasions. But in this Polaroid photograph, we see him in a way as he would have preferred to be seen, as he nurtures his garden, was very connected with nature. It turns out, unfortunately, that the photograph in red was the one that would become his epitaph, because Boring was ultimately murdered in an unsolved crime. To this day, we don't know the circumstances by which he died. All we do know is that he was axed by some assailant, and then his body was burned in the house he lived in. So not only is T.C. Boring no longer with us, but the house depicted in the scene has been destroyed. Thank you for coming on this mini tour of the Eggleston Portraits exhibition. I hope you'll come and enjoy not just these few, but all the wonderful photographs in this display. That's the end of the Mini Curators tour. Now I want to point out some discrepancies with what was said in the Mini Curators tour in London and what was said in the article by Oxford Americans magazine called Perfectly Boring, related to my father's unsolved murder. You are about to see how there's different claims about Tom's murder with photos of him in his home. Below here is a couple of photographs taken from the article Perfectly Boring. I'm going to read out the article to you so you better understand what I'm talking about. Before I read out the article, I want to point out to you so you can look out for where it states that the photograph of Tom standing in the nude in his red bedroom called Untitled, T.C. Boring, 1972 by William Eggleston was not taken in the same room that the famed photograph of the red ceiling with the bare light bulb by William Eggleston was taken. I want to go over with you all now the Perfectly Boring article about where the red ceiling photograph was taken. The article went on to state, in his small house on MacArthur Avenue, Boring had constructed a countercultural all to himself. He painted the master bedroom a dark red. The living room largely lacked furniture, while the rest of the house was filled with broken appliances and junk. There was rarely food in the refrigerator, and the cabinets, too, were empty. Visitors to the house remember purplish lights and the constant smell of burning incense. This period of Boring's life is memorialized in the most jarring photograph included in the seminal William Eggleston's Guide, the first solo collection of color photography ever published by the Museum of Modern Art. It's a portrait of sorts of Boring in his bedroom, his bed unmade, a cigarette dangling from the dresser. A large oxygen tank stands propped in the corner, and you can make out a few words scrawled in black on the walls. Tally-ho! And Mona! And God. The photo stands out bluntly among shots of dirt roads, and the southern gentry, Boring standing nude and bewildered in his room, Michelangelo's David recast as a sordid southern acid freak. The house on MacArthur Avenue was not the house in the red ceiling. Just before dawn on January morning in 1970, the Greenwood police knocked on Boring's front door and announced that he had a search warrant. Okay, that's the end. As you can see, the article states that the house on MacArthur Avenue, where the photo of my father standing in the nude was taken by William Eggleston, is not the house that the photo of the red ceiling was taken by William Eggleston. Perfectly Boring article is claiming that the red ceiling photograph was taken at 103 Virginia Street where Tom was murdered. If you would like to learn more about the Oxford American article Perfectly Boring from my point of view, then you're more than welcome to listen to episode 10 and 11 on my podcast that gives you an overview of the article Perfectly Boring. I want to point out that the National Portrait Gallery has a different claim as to where the red ceiling photograph was taken compared to where Oxford American Magazine claims it was taken in their article Perfectly Boring. As a matter of fact, the National Portrait Gallery's mini Curators tour stated that the photo of my father standing in the nude in his red room is where the red ceiling photograph was taken by William Eggleston. Not only that, they also stated that the house where the photograph of my father standing in the nude and the red ceiling is no longer standing. The National Portrait Gallery stated in its mini Curators tour that both photographs were taken at 103 Virginia Street, where my father was murdered. You distinctly hear Phillip Prodger claim to everyone that Tom was murdered where these photos were taken. He never mentioned anything about him dying of smoke inhalation. He mentioned about the axe that supposedly murdered my father from the accounts of William Eggleston. He said his body was burned, but we don't know or hear anything about Tom's house burning down. In my opinion, Philip's mini Curators tour was very misleading on the facts of how my father was murdered and where he was murdered. I also wrote about the National Portrait Gallery of London's mini Curators tour in my father's biography I wrote and published last year, called The True Legacy of Dr. Tom Boring, an Unsolved Murder Mystery Biography. I want to share with you all what I wrote in his biography. Before I go, I want to quickly read a couple of pages from his biography that speak about the National Portrait Gallery's mini Curators tour and the National Portrait Gallery exhibition called William Eggleston's Portraits. Here's what I said on page 156 to 158. On page 156, you see the Polaroid photograph of Tom taken by William Eggleston called Untitled 1970, Dr. T.C. Boring, Greenwood, Mississippi. The exhibition that featured this Polaroid photograph of Tom taken by William Eggleston is called William Eggleston Portraits. The exhibition was held at the National Portrait Gallery in London from July 21st to October 23rd of 2016. It explored the career of William Eggleston from the 1960s to the present day. 100 images along with William's film Stranded in Canton were shown. The show included some major works from the 1970s, such as photos of Dennis Hopper, DeVoe Money of Jackson, Mississippi, Clash frontman Joe Strummer, and the photographs of Tom Boring standing in the nude in his bedroom located on MacArthur Street, titled Untitled T.C. Boring, 1972, along with a Polaroid photo of Tom taken by William Eggleston. The show opened with black and white photography. For some of his shots, Eggleston used police surveillance film and a miniature spy camera. He reduced the size of the film and cut out new sprockets in the dark by hand to fit in his camera, and then he took the picture. Also included with the exhibition was the curator of the National Photography Curators mini tour of portraits used in the Eggleston exhibition. Phillip Prodger was the curator of the mini tour in this exhibition. You hear Phillip speak about images taken by William of Tom and his home in the early 1970s during the mini tour. The image of Tom that Phillip speaks about in the mini tour is titled Untitled T.C. Boring, 1972, Greenwood, Mississippi, and he is also seen speaking about a Polaroid photograph taken by William Eggleston known as Untitled 1970, Dr. T.C. Boring, Greenwood, Mississippi. He then shows you William's photo taken of Tom titled Untitled T.C. Boring, 1972, while stating more false claims about Tom's life. And he decorated his home in extraordinary ways, spray painting the words God, tally-ho, and the name Mona on the wall. Those are all his doing. And he created these colored rooms in his house. So he had a red room. This is exactly the same red room that was in the famous photograph of the red ceiling with the bare light bulb. The red ceiling by Eggleston was taken there. Well, that's how Eggleston saw him most occasions, but this Polaroid photograph we see him in a way that he would have preferred to be seen, as he nurtures his garden, as he is very connected with nature. Then Philippe begins to state his and Eggleston's claim of how Tom was murdered by saying, "It turns out, unfortunately, that the photograph in red was the one that would become his epitaph, because Boring was ultimately murdered in an unsolved crime. To this day, we don't know the circumstances by which he died. All we know is that he was axed by some assailant, and then his body was burned in the house he lived in. So not only is T.C. Boring no longer with us, but the house depicted in the scene has been destroyed." Stop right there, Mr. Phillip Prodger. Did I just hear you right? Philippe's claim about Tom's unsolved murder is false. The home that this photograph was taken in by William still stands to this day. As well, Philippe's comment earlier about how Tom was murdered with an axe to his head is a lie. These claims that William Eggleston and Phillip Prodger have made about Tom's unsolved murder that are put alongside photographs taken of him in the nude and his home on MacArthur Street are all made up. William has no proof to back up his claim about Tom being murdered with an axe to his head. Nor does he have proof that the red ceiling photograph, formerly known as Untitled Greenwood, Mississippi, 1973, and Untitled T.C. Boring, 1972, Greenwood, Mississippi, were taken at 103 Virginia Street. William Eggleston's cousin, Maud Schuler Clay, is a witness for him, stating that these claims he has made about the red ceiling photograph being taken at 103 Virginia Street are true and factual. She has no credibility for a good witness for William Eggleston and his false claims that he makes about my father's legacy and unsolved murder. So it looks like to me, as you can see, Tom's legacy has been fabricated by his buddy William for his gain and profit. By William putting out false claims about Tom's life and unsolved murder alongside photos of him and his home in Greenwood, Mississippi for money and profit, then he is thereby misleading and misinforming collectors and buyers of his work about Tom's life and his unsolved murder. It's very unfortunate for Tom that his legacy has been fabricated for other people's gain and profit. I guess you would say that I'm here to clean up the mess that was made for his legacy and unsolved murder. He is dead and he cannot speak for himself, so I will help him out and speak up for him. This concludes what I wrote about the National Portrait Gallery's mini Curators tour, spreading false claims about my father's unsolved murder. I'm going to end the episode here. I hope you all were able to clearly understand from my observation and me stating so in the podcast episode how my father's life and unsolved murder has been fabricated and slandered. If there's anything that you did not understand and you need clarity on, then could you please comment if you have any questions for me about my episode and what you need clarity on. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe and leave a comment. I'll see you next episode. Until then, goodbye everyone.